Just like to start with a personal thank you to the Raw family for hosting this event, and also a personal thanks to the Lobels. It's a great compliment to be introduced by someone in such glowing terms who is himself a man of genuine achievement. Not sure about mine, but let's try and take a look this evening at the subject. The suggestion for this evening's talk was that we look at the question of speech and its power, and the Jewish view, or the Torah insight, the Torah view of this tool of human speech and what it means. With your permission, I'd like to take a slightly different or unusual, perhaps, route through the subject, because many of you have some background in the subject, or you have easy access to discussions of the subject of Lashon Hara, what in English we mistranslate as slander. But the problems of speech, saying things that are negative about people, all the laws attached to that, the conditions, preconditions, exceptions, etc. The Chofetz Chaim Foundation does tremendous work in publicizing those facts. And therefore, with your permission, let's take a slightly different angle. Let's take a tour through slightly less charted waters, if you like, and try to study something from a deep perspective and something from a slightly more unusual angle. And that is the nature of speech itself and what it means in depth. And I'd like to take a special look at the problem of wasted words. Torah has a very special prohibition of saying things that are nonsense, quite apart from saying things that are hurtful or negative. Saying things that do no harm but are meaningless. Some of us do a little bit of that from time to time. I'm sure in present companies excluded. And I'm sure New York in general is not a place where that happens, but there are places where people do spend time expressing things that are relatively meaningless, and that's a very deep and serious Torah prohibition. So let's see if we can try and work out together some of the depth behind this. Now, we'll need to stay together on a wavelength that we may not all be familiar with traversing. Because we need to discuss, we need to study areas that are deeper than can really be expressed in words. The paradox of this evening's discussion is that we'll be using words to talk about things that really cannot be expressed in words. Right? The mystical conception is that the words are always inadequate, because the words are always finite and packaged pieces of a reality that's always deeper. In fact, if you think about it, you'll realize that the way you grasp something is never the way you succeed in putting it into words. Even if you speak a lot and very accurate words, you can never really communicate the thing itself. You can talk about the thing, but you cannot say the thing itself. In fact, anyone who's lived at all knows that genuine communication doesn't require any speech at all. The more words you have to say in a relationship, the worse you're doing. The more you have to say, the less the chances that you'll get it across. If the relationship is where it should be, then just a very subtle indication of expression will be more than adequate. It's very interesting to look at your faces, because the mystics always say that women understand this naturally and men don't. And this audience, the camera should be on the audience, because the ladies are all going yes and the men are going huh? You'll have to ask your wife afterwards and she'll explain it to you. But that is the gift that women have in this area is the ability to grasp a thing as it is. Let's take a look at the subject itself and see if we can discover a depth that's perhaps a little new to us. First of all, what's the meaning of this tool of speech altogether? Now, using the faculty that we've appealed to, which is the faculty of understanding a thing as it is and not getting trapped in the words. Let's see if we can use a few clumsy words to describe this. The Torah concept of speech, and that's a deep mystical conception, it's a universal thing, anyone who's sensitive about this process will be able to identify it, is that speech in essence is the mechanism of connection between the higher and the lower worlds. You know that all of mystical study really hinges on the point of connection between worlds, between levels. It's the connection between male and female that bears fruit. In fact, the tongue is known as a circumcision in Kabbalistic writing. The tongue, it's called Bris HaLashon, it's the covenant of the tongue. This is not the place to go into detail, but it's the equivalent in the higher world, the world of the head, of the concept of the concept of bris milah, of circumcision, and its function in transmitting covenant and in transmitting birth. The difference is that in the body, the formation is that of the human body, that means of children, and in the higher world of speech, the transmission and the formation is that of students. By Avram and Sarah, it says that the Torah refers to the people that they made, the souls whom they made in Haran. The simple translation would seem to suggest the children that they bore, but we know they did not have children. And of course what's being referred to is the people they taught. Because what the body produces in the lower world, the mouth produces in the higher world. In fact, that's one of the reasons why your relationship with your Rabbi is more intense than your relationship with your father. You know that the halacha is that if one's father's life is at risk, and one's Torah teacher's life is at risk, and you can save only one, you're obliged to save your Rebbe's life. Right? The reason is that he brings you into the higher world, whereas your father only brings you into the lower world. Of course, if you're not happy with that, then the way to neutralize that is that if you pay for your son's Torah education, if you pay for your children's Torah education, you then acquire the din of being his father and his Rebbe. So then he'd certainly have to save you first, which means that you have to put your money where your mouth is and send your children for a Torah education. But the idea of teaching, of speaking, is making a connection between the higher and the lower worlds. Let's try and look at that for a few moments and understand it better. Speech is really is a world of connections. Stay carefully with me. When I speak to you, what's happening is a connection is being forged between us. Something here which really cannot be put into words is somehow clumsily being packaged in words. It then transmits itself through the medium of space and physicality to you, and you then retranslate it into essence in your mind. That's a remarkable and absurd process. The Kuzari says that this is an absurdity, but that's the way the world works. It's a lesson in the connection between higher and lower worlds, between spirit and physicality. It's a connection between people, and it's a connection between ideas and practical application. What's in here has no revelation in the world. When I think something, you cannot experience it in the world. You cannot see it. There's no way that doesn't have expression. But when I speak it out, and of course speech does not only mean that which the mouth does. Speech is any physical expression of that which I intend. It could be in writing, it could be in gesture. That is all speech. What I've done is connected the abstract spiritual world with the physical world of expression. In fact, for those who have some Hebrew background, you'll know that the word davar, dibur, speech in Hebrew is dibur. The root dabar in Hebrew does not mean speaking literally. It means what we call hanhoga. It means a controlling influence that comes down from the spiritual world and manipulates or handles the physical world. Like in Tanakh, you find the expression dabar, or you find in the writings of the sages, and in verses you find dabar echad lador, which means dabar really means a leader, a figurehead of leadership in a generation. Doesn't mean necessarily one who speaks for the generation. Or we have a verse that says, Yadber amim tachtenu. He will subdue nations beneath us. Right? That word is really a language of subjugation. It means that the spiritual energy or the force of direction manifests in physicality. That's what speech is. Can we find some way of grasping this? You know that the mouth, you know that the Kabbalistic tradition is that if you look at the organ that does something and you study it objectively, you'll learn everything that you need to know about that thing. That means, let's put it in more general terms, the part of the body that's involved in any function is always the illustration of that function, so that you can learn the spiritual depth of that faculty by studying the way it manifests in the body. Every part of the body is an illustration of that. But we don't have time to go into that idea in general. But speech, let's take that as an example. The mouth, which is the organ of speech, has three functions. If you study it objectively and you observe the world, or you refer to Torah sources, you'll find that the mouth has three functions. Those are speaking, eating, and kissing. That's remarkable. We know that if one organ performs three things, those three things must be one thing. Right? Because if that same part of the body has more than one function, that means those functions emanate from the same source. We always look to the unitary dimension of the source in order to understand something. That's exactly what Torah is all about. What's the connection between eating, speaking, and kissing? You know, the Talmud actually discusses the fact that it would have been more appropriate to have more than one mouth. The Gemara itself asks, why do we speak and eat with the same mouth? The Gemara says we make enough trouble with one mouth, and that's why we were given only one. But at a deeper level, eating, these three functions are one. What are they? Speaking is the connection that we've described, connection between people, connection between the higher world of ideas and the lower world of physical expression. Eating is the world of connection. The mystical conception is that food is the energy that, I'm sure you can see it already, keeps the higher world within the lower world. If you eat, the soul, the neshama, is bound to the body. Food is that remarkable connection, that remarkable energy, which is required to keep the neshama inside the body. If you don't eat, the neshama begins to distract itself out of the body. Eventually one faints, and if one doesn't eat for long enough, there's a complete dissociation between the two. In fact, the Nefesh HaChaim says that that's the secret behind the sacrifices. What is the concept of sacrifices? When we bring korbanos, we bring sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple. What's the concept of sacrifice? Unbelievably, and you have to be very cautious how you express this, the ritual or the process of sacrifices is the process of the world eating. The body of the world is the cosmic reality that manifests in physical terms, and the neshama, the soul of the world, is the divine presence within it. And to keep those two incredible opposites together requires the energy of food. We take in food into our bodies, and it has to be spiritually perfect. It's the idea behind kosher food, the mystical conception behind it, and the importance of exactly how we eat and what we eat. And in cosmic terms, the world has its soul retained within it and held within it by means of the sacrifices, which we feed, as it were, to the Creator. You know, be very careful how this is expressed. That's why the altar, the Mizbeach, is known as Shulchan Gavur, the table of Hashem. And all the laws of the sacrifices parallel the laws of a meal and of eating. Expressed as korbani lachmi, my sacrifice is my bread. In terms of bread that a human being eats, that's its equivalent. That's a wonderful and deep idea. But that's the concept, that the world of connection is expressed in speech, in speech, and it's expressed in eating. Eating is necessary in order to keep the connection of the higher world maintained with the body. And the third function of the mouth is kissing. And it's no accident that the mouth performs that function too. You know that kissing is a universal human expression of bondage, of bonding, of love, and of warmth and closeness between husband and wife, parent and child. That's an absurdity. That's an absurdity. If you descended from Mars, and I asked you to design a mechanism of physical expression of closeness between people, I'm quite confident that is the last thing you would have come up with. You might have come up with, gently and sensitively putting your foreheads together. Or some other, but kissing, it's bizarre. First of all, it's unhealthy. It's absurd. We don't think so because we're so used to it. That doesn't bother us. But if you were objective and you looked at it, it's bizarre. But the reason is that the mouth is the organ of connection, and therefore it fulfills those functions of connection in the world. Again, there's a much deeper level here that relates to marriage, and again, this is not the appropriate place to discuss it, but I leave you to research it on your own. Now, that is a beginning of understanding of why the Torah puts such emphasis on correct speech. Can you see what's happening if you speak wrongly? You're breaking the connection. What is the mystical problem with speaking a lie, for example? Can you see what you're doing? The function of speech is to connect what's in here with what's inside you. Do you know what an absolute definition of good is? You know that the definition we use of good is what Hashem says. But if you were a natural scientist, that means you examine the world in natural terms. Could you come up with a definition of that which is good in natural terms without reference to the Torah? I once heard a great Torah sage of the previous generation, of Simcha Wasserman. He said that a natural definition of goodness is using a tool for that for which it was designed. Isn't that beautiful? And using a tool for that for which it was not designed is evil. And by the way, you see the results. If you take a tool and use it for what it was designed for, it does the job, and the tool is maintained perfect. If you take a tool and try to use it for that for which it was not designed, the job does not get done and the tool gets damaged. And all the consequences that that tool was supposed to do, right, will be, if you take one of these things that record sound, and you use it to record sound, and by the way, you don't need to be taught. If you observe what it does, you'll see what it does. And you could figure out, if you have natural wisdom, how to use the world. But if you insist on using this thing to knock nails into the wall, so first of all, you won't get the nails in. First of all, you'll break the thing. That's the first thing that will happen. Then you won't get the nail in the wall. So the bookshelf you were going to put on the thing is not going to be there. The books are going to fall off. The wisdom from, etc., etc., going to destroy the world. Male-female relationships, for example, since we've entered that zone. Hasn't this generation smashed those entirely? Some of the perversions of this generation are such an obvious misuse of a system that is so clearly designed, so clearly manifesting what it should be used for. And the consequences are predictable. Speech is there in order to connect. It's in order to share with you what's in here. If I tell a lie, what am I doing? I'm using a tool for its opposite. Can you see that? I'm taking this tool that is designed to share with you what's in here, and I'm using it for exactly the opposite of what it was. And that, by definition, is evil. And that will lead to a whole range of negative consequences. Not only that, but it's a treachery. It's a perversion of the highest gift. The human being is uniquely the one who speaks, right? And it's a perversion of the highest gift. It's a perversion of the gift of intimacy. That's what misuse of speech is. The reason Lashon Hara, which I'm sure many of you have studied previous to this, is that the prohibition of Lashon Hara, the mystical depth of it, is, you're well aware, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you're well aware, I'm sure, that Lashon Hara is not saying something false about someone which is harmful. You're aware of that. It's saying something true about someone which is negative. That's Lashon Hara. When you say something false about someone, and you give them a negative reputation that they don't deserve, right, and you say a falsehood about them, which is slanderous, that's a whole category of sin in its own right. But when you say Lashon Hara, you say something true. You say the person gets angry easily, right? You say that they are insensitive. You say something perfectly accurate, no exaggeration. If you say that the rabbi can't sing, and that the chazan doesn't give a good drosha, that's pure Lashon Hara. If you say that the rabbi doesn't give a good drosha and the chazan can't sing, that's murder. Right? But that's a deeper level. But when you say a thing about someone that is accurate, perfectly accurate, and it's negative about them, they would not wish it said, that's Lashon Hara. Why is that such a negative? You know, the mystical sources say that it's worse than murder, idolatry, sexual immorality, in a certain sense. Why is it worse than those things? But can you see what's happening? When you say a thing, think together with me. What's worse about saying something negative about someone that's true than saying a lie about someone? The one dimension in which it's much worse. And you know why? Because when you say a lie about someone, you're not using speech. You're using what appears to be speech, but you're not using speech. When you say a lie about someone, you're not using the tool of speech. You're using a perversion of the tool of speech. Again, speech is communicating with you what's in here. If I say a lie, I've not used speech. I've perverted the tool of speech, and that's evil. But when I say Lashon Hara, I'm saying something to you that is true about someone else. That is speech, and I've betrayed it. And that's why Lashon Hara is worse in many ways than the sin of saying falsehood. Because I'm using genuine speech. I am sharing with you the truth. It's a correct communication, and it's damaging. So that's a much deeper treachery of the tool of speech than many others. And that, again, is a subject in its own right. We're just making some of these remarks as an introduction, a basic introduction to the area of speech. I hope we're beginning to feel together. I presume you have no trouble understanding an accent, an English that has no accent. Right? After David's introduction, you were well used to it. So I'm sure you're with me. But we are here trying to study the center of this concept so we can see its ramifications, applications in Torah. You know, the idea continues, and it's an endless thing. We don't have time this evening to explore it in full. But let me share with you one more illustration. You know where speech originates? Here. Speech originates in the throat, correct? This is where the sound is produced. Actually, the mystics say that speech originates in its depth in the chest, because the breath is the vehicle of speech. Before you say any sound, you must say the sound of the breath. And that, of course, is why the word neshima in Hebrew, which means breath, and neshama, which means the soul, are almost the same word. That's a subject for another time. But speech itself, where the vocalization begins, takes place in the throat. Now, we learned already this evening that the part of the body, what did we study? The part of the body that manifests something is the lesson in what that thing does. You don't have to even look in a Torah source if you're sensitive to the world. Why does speech begin in the neck? There's no, again, if you have the misfortune to be brought up in a pattern of Western thinking, So then you think that it's a genetic evolutionary accident. It's random. Once when you were a gorilla, you grunted, or whatever else it was you were doing in the trees, and that kind of got left with you till now, so you're still grunting. But that is not the way a Jew looks at the world. A Ben Torah doesn't look at the world that way. If a certain part of the body does something, we understand it was designed to do that thing, and it's very specific. What's remarkable about the neck? The neck is the organ of connection between the higher world and the lower world. Thank you. Vodka? Next one. Thank you. The neck is the organ of connection between the higher world and the lower world. Is that correct? And therefore speech, which is the function of connection between higher and lower worlds, originates in the neck. You know, your head you didn't have to have a neck. You know, you could have been like this. Yeah. It's the connection. The mystics go even further, of course. Speech is produced not only in the neck, but in the front of the neck. You know that Kabbalistically, the front of any function, the front of any organ, the front of any part of the body is always its side of elevation and spirituality. And the back is always the side of darkness and negativity. The front is always that which manifests the personality, the internality. You know what the front is called in Hebrew? Panim. Panim is the face. Do you know that the same word in Hebrew is pnim, which means the inside? It's one of those remarkable Hebrew words. Hebrew has many words in which a word has the same meaning and its opposite. It has one meaning and its opposite inherent in the same word. That's remarkable and unique to Hebrew. The word panim means the outer face, and pnim means the internality. And the connection is that the place you see the internality most sharply is in the face. It's, for example, why the face does not get clothed. We do not clothe it because there's no shame in the face. The body is clothed because it's subject to shame. The face retains its original spirituality. That level where Adam and Chava were unclothed and not ashamed. Why? Because the externality, the beauty of their bodies reflected the internality. There was no reason to hide the body. When you looked at their bodies, you saw the internality, you saw the spirit. They were incandescent with spirituality. Today, when you look at a human being, you see an animal. If you look very, very carefully at a human being, you see a faint glow someplace, usually on the face, what's called ziv aponim, that shows you that this is not an animal. But Adam and Chava, the original generation, the original formation, the original human beings who lived, when you looked at them, you saw only the spirit. You saw a luminescent spirituality. And if you looked very carefully, you made out the wisp of a body. And therefore, they wore no clothes, because the clothes are a sign of shame. We use them in the opposite capacity as a sign of dignity. That's how we turn it into sanctity. And that's why this generation is so badly clothed, by the way. Not accidental at all. Clothes, you know what the Hebrew word? We're going to digress here for a moment. You know what the Hebrew word for a garment is? Beged. You know what beged is? The same word as treachery. And you know what beged is? If you take the aleph base in Hebrew, it goes aleph base gimel dalet, right? First you have the aleph, which is the ethereal, ephemeral, transcendent letter of perfection. That's why it has no sound in the world. And aleph is always the divine letter. And aleph is made of 2 yuds and a vav. 26, the number of Hashem's name. Right? The yud, the 10 higher dimensions, the 10 highest spiritual elements reflected in their mirror image in the world, joined by the letter of connection. A vav in Hebrew is the hook. Vav means a hook. Vav is the letter that means and in Hebrew, which is conjunction letter. So aleph, right? And what does the word aleph mean? Aleph in Hebrew means to elevate spiritually, to train or to teach. Aleph is the highest rank in the military system. Aleph is the highest number in the decimal system. By the way, the words elevate and elephant are directly derived from the Hebrew. English is directly derived from Hebrew on a Kabbalistic level. But for that, you'll have to invite me back another time. We don't have time for that. But that's the idea. Aleph is the ephemeral letter of spirituality. And immediately after the Aleph appears in the world, you have Beis Gimel Dalet, Beged, the garment that clothes the spiritual light, and of course betrays it. The garment is the place of treachery. The garment can be the garment of one team or army, while the wearer is belonging to the other. So it's the hider of shame. And in case you think it's accidental and, imaginative, the other word for a garment in Hebrew is levush. And the Medaktikim, those who comment on this level of Hebrew, say that the word levush is lobosh, not to be ashamed. Same thing. Me'il, by the way, an outer garment is called a me'il in Hebrew. Me'il is the same word as me'ilah, You know what Me'ila is? The sin of going into the temple and taking out the holy things for profane use. Treachery of the spiritual world being brought into the external world. All the same idea. These are all connections of the concept of an internality being connected to an externality and done correctly, and being betrayed in being done incorrectly. The front of a thing is always the side of spirituality. Right? And therefore the voice is produced in the front of the throat. The back is always the side that is the side of darkness, of excretion, of negativity, of non-recognizability. You know, you recognize the halacha is that a person has to be recognized in situations where we need testimony in identification of a person. It always has to be done from the face. And by the way, it's the only place you can identify someone. You know that? You know how you recognize someone? By their face. The hands are also very expressive, but not good enough to identify the person. And the back of the head and the back of the neck are very, very close, but not good enough. How often have you walked up to someone and given them a mighty slap on the back, believing they were an old friend? Right? And when they turn around, you have a very uncomfortable feeling because they're not. Right? You think you can identify someone from the back, but it's not correct. But from the face, there's a remarkable sense. In animals, it's not so. You know that? You cannot identify an animal uniquely by his face, unless he has some outstanding feature. But a human being, even identical twins, if you're sensitive, can be told apart by the face. So the front is always the side of spirituality, and the back is the side of darkness. The front of the neck, you know what this part of the neck is called in Kabbalistic terms, the place where speech is formed? You know what this part of the body is referred to in the Kabbalistic world? Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. Why? Wasn't he the voice of the world? Wasn't he the mouthpiece, the channel through which Torah is brought to the world? Shechina medaberes mitoich korona shel Moshe. The Shechina, the divine presence, speaks through the throat of Moses. The throat is always the point of origin of speech. You know, when Hashem commands the prophet to go and call out in prophecy, he says, Kra begaron al tachsoich. Cry out in your throat, do not hold back. That's not how you talk about speech. If I command you to speak, don't I refer to the mouth? You hear the problem. Why does the Torah refer to prophecy and target the throat? You know what's being said? Speech is with the mouth, but prophecy is with the point of origin of speech, much deeper. And therefore it's the voice itself that speaks in prophecy. You remember when Avram Avinu, you remember when Abraham and Sarah, she discerned the difference between Yishmael and Yitzchak. Yishmael, who was negative, a negative influence, and she wanted him banished from the house. And Avram Avinu didn't understand that she was right. And of course, having that woman's insight into personality, that's uniquely her gift, and especially into children, God himself had to tell Abraham to listen to her. But you know what the words are in the Torah? Shma b'koila, listen to her voice. So if you read Torah in a superficial, careless manner, you think it means listen to what she's saying. But the Torah doesn't use words carelessly. It does not say listen to her words. It says listen to her voice. Surely the right thing is to say listen to her words. When you're talking about prophecy, you don't talk about words. You talk about the origin of words. You talk about the voice itself. Because that's the source out of which the words well. The words are always inadequate. The words are always finite packages. The voice itself, that could express something. No amount of words could ever express the potency and the meaning of the scream of a child in the night. So speech is the world of connection. You know that the front of the throat is called Moshe Rabbeinu. Do you know what the back of the neck is called? Do you know what this part of the body is in Hebrew? Ha'oref. Ha'oref. Oref means the back of the neck. If you rearrange the letters of Ha'oref, it spells Paroi, Pharaoh. Moshe Rabbeinu, the spiritual connection, and his arch enemy who tries to keep the spiritual voice out of the world and enslave the Jewish people so that voice cannot be manifest, Paroi. These are some of the parameters, some of the depths of understanding, just a beginning of what is this function of speech and its level of connection. Let's move on using this introduction. There's a lot more to say about it. This is really the center of all spiritual wisdom. The concept of speech is the point of origin of the human. And there's a lot more to say about it than that. But let's move on and look briefly at the world of misuse of speech in one or two dimensions. You know that the way to train this faculty, of course, do you know what the way to train speech is? Silence. Because silence is the vehicle of expressing what is really meant. And therefore the exercise of training communication is not to speak. Rav Rav Dessler says that if one shares an idea that one has recently grasped, you lose it. You know that? You hear that? If you learn something in Torah, you learn something deep in wisdom, if you share it before it's settled, if you share it, if you spit it out, right, before you've taken it in properly, you lose it. Rav Simcha Zissel once waited 25 years after coming upon a tremendous Torah Chiddush before sharing it with his students. He felt he would risk losing it if he expressed it, right? And he waited for 25 years for it to settle. A brilliant piece of Torah. He waited for it to settle before he could dare risk speaking it. Why do you lose it if you speak it? Because if you can bring it down to the finite packages of little words, so then it's descended from the dimension of what it genuinely is. It's a message this generation needs. Right? This is a generation, and I imagine that not far from here are some of the points of origin of a lot of the empty words that are spat out into this world. You know what the Maharal says? The Maharal says that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, had a speech defect. He had a speech defect. So the pathetic and brutal anti-Semitic nonsense that's taught is that he had an imperfection. Probably had a psychological problem. Probably when he's 3, his father insulted him. Didn't ask him if school was fun. You know what the Maharal says? That Moshe Rabbeinu's speech defect was a manifestation of his perfection. We're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. We're talking about speech itself. You know why he couldn't speak well? Because he was living in a world where things are grasped as they really are, and those things can't be put into words. Therefore, he couldn't say the words. His grasp of a thing was the essential way the thing really is. As soon as you're going to start trying to package it in words, you're going to bring it down into a finite. If you meet someone, and in the first 20 minutes of that friendship, you tell them everything about yourself, that's who you are, 20 minutes of speech. If there's no more to be discovered to you than what you can put into words, that's who you are, that bundle of advertising copy. The art of being human is that every time anyone gets to know a depth to your personality, they only begin to realize that there's a lot more they didn't discover yet. His imperfection was a sign of his perfection. Right? To take Torah, to take his knowledge of Hashem, to take his connection with the divine world and bring it down into finite words would be a distraction. We're making those things finite, and by definition they're infinite. But you know that says that after the Torah was given, he spoke normally. You know that? After the Torah was given, you know the last book of the Chumash, Dvarim, what does it say? Ele Dvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the words that Moses spoke. He had no trouble speaking then. Why? Because after Torah was given, Hashem himself performed that miracle of taking the spiritual wisdom that cannot be put into words and putting it into words. That's what it means that God appeared on the mountain. The divine, spiritual, infinite world melted in and meshed with the physical world. Impossible, but that's what happened. The Torah was contained in finite words. The infinite wisdom of the Torah became contained in 600,000 letters on a parchment, which is impossible, but that's what happened. After that miracle was put into the world, then he was able to speak. Let's try. Do you have a little energy to take this a little further? Let's try and descend one level beneath this. Silence, of course, is the training of being able to conceptualize depth before one attempts to bring it down into that which can be expressed. The parallel in the personality is capturing in your own life a depth that is so far more intense than that which you can express that there's a hope of achieving some level of spirituality. You know, a remarkable illustration, I'd like to share with you a remarkable illustration of this. If you look in Pasha Shmini, the Haftarah, you'll see a remarkable description there. It's an incident in Tanakh. We happen to read it then as that Haftarah. You know that a remarkable incident occurs over there. Again, stand well. This is one of those remarkable illustrations. You know, it says that King David was bringing the ark. You remember? They were bringing the Aron Kodesh. They were bringing it up, right, closer to its final resting place. And David was dancing. King David was bringing it as he didn't have the merit to build a temple, but he did everything that he could. And while he was bringing the ark up, he danced in front of it in a dance of tremendous manifestation of inner depth. His dance was amazing. His dance was so amazing, was so expressive, whatever the correct word is, that Michal, his wife, daughter of Saul, she was watching from the window, and she was deeply hurt and concerned. And when they met, she criticized him for his revelation. She said to him like this, "Was that fitting for a king of Israel? To reveal yourself the way you did in the street in front of the maidservants and the common people? That means you danced in a way that was unbecoming. Your dignity was compromised. The dignity, the depth of what you are as David, King David, was perverted there. In the eyes of the maidservant." And David's answer, remarkable answer. David says to her, "I will belittle myself even more than this. I will be even lighter than this." The words there used are ke'echad ha'reikim. Listen carefully to these words. Like one of the empty people. She said to him, "You danced in the street like an empty fellow." Listen carefully, the words are amazing. "You danced in the street like an empty fellow." And he said, "I will belittle myself and empty myself even more than that." You know, there's an interpretation of those words which is striking. And by the way, you know what it says right after that? That because of her criticism of him, which was wrong, she was mistaken in her criticism, she never had a child until the day of her death. Those are the words. Some commentaries say it means she died, in fact, in childbirth. Until the day of her death means literally that. What was this conversation? You think the Tanakh is recording here a quibble between husband and wife? She thought that he was a little bit undignified, and he thought that he wasn't undignified. She thought that his ankles showed. His knees, maybe. Much, much deeper. You know what the discussion was? When David danced in the street, it was such an expression of internality. We're not talking here about a person dancing in the street. We're talking about King David expressing his neshama. Dance is an expression of speech. Anything that the body does is an expression of the spirit. Do you know what dance is? Dance is one of the most intense and amazing expressions. It's not only the mouth and the tongue moving, it's the body moving in its entirety which expresses an inner emotion. We won't insult the level of this discussion by referring to what dance has become and what it should be. And of course it can be the most sordid expression. Of course it can. It must be. Because it's connected to that energy too. But it can also be the most spiritual of expressions. David was dancing in a way that he danced so expressively in the street that you could see his neshama. And that she felt was wrong. Why? Because the obligation of a human being is that there should always be more hidden than that which is revealed. If you could dance in such a way that we see all of you, you have converted all of you into those movements. There must always be a well, an unquenchable well of depth that goes beyond that which can be expressed. And when he expressed himself entirely, so she felt he transgressed that prohibition of translating your inner dimension into physical expression. And David's words, and listen to the words, ke'echad ha'reikim, like one of the empty fellows. You emptied yourself entirely. You spat out into physical expression so much of yourself that there was nothing left. And what was David's answer? You think that's all there is? You think that what I showed out there is everything that there is? It's only a small part of what remains hidden. She was wrong about it. And it could be that her dying in childbirth was a midah keneged midah, to bring life into the world, to bring the spiritual dimension from the hidden into the revealed. Right? She had to learn through that, as it were, to re-correct the level that she had. We're talking about people that are this is not criticism, of course, we're talking about people of cosmic dimensions here. We're talking about imperfections that we would not be able to grasp even. That is the beginning of a discussion of speech and its potency, of the energies that have to be retained behind speech. Let's look at this problem of empty words. You better hold on to your seats for this because it gets a little rough, a little frightening. You know that the prohibition of what's called dvarim batalim. Dvarim batalim means wasted words. Of course, we should all realize from the preceding discussion that we're not only talking about words. Dvarim b'tailim really means any expression of who you are that is to waste. Any action of the body or any time that you spend, which is not an expression of internality correctly applied. And that's called Dvarim b'tailim. But in its primary form, in its classic form, let's say, in its model, it is talking nonsense. Stay with me carefully, because we have to descend into levels here that are remarkably deep, as far as we're able, as far as our hand can reach. You know, wasting words. First of all, it's a tremendous Torah prohibition. Do you know that the Gaon of Vilna says that there's a special dimension of punishment in the world to come for wasted words? You know that? You know, we have a dimension called Gehenna. You know, Gehenna is the dimension of suffering or punishment in the afterlife, or retribution, or correction, whatever you want to call it. There's a special form of Gehenna for the words you spoke that were meaningless. It's called kaf hakela. Kaf hakela. You know what that means? I don't know how you translate it in English, but kaf hakela means the cup of the slingshot. You know, a slingshot has a expansible, stretchable part, and it has the part that holds the projectile. That part is called kaf, the spoon or the cup. Kaf hakela. That is what a neshama experiences, a Gehenna that's got that name for wasted words. And the Gaon of Vilna says, for every word you wasted, in the next world you have to be flung from one end of the cosmic universe to the other. Why? Why? What does this mean? You know, we have a concept that correction in the next world, every form of correction is always midah keneged midah, exactly appropriate to the sin or the crime or the damage. The reason, of course, is because it must be a correction, and therefore it must target exactly the problem that occurred. So why is wasted words, why is that sin expressing itself in its punishment as being flung from one end? Do you know what the deeper commentaries say? That this punishment is the experience, listen well, of the neshama being flung from one place to another, having a sense of arriving at its destination, and as it's about to arrive, being flung again to some other place. And as it's about to rest at that point of dimension, of destination, it's then flung again. And that's the constant experience. Why is that bizarre experience the appropriate punishment for wasted words? Well, I'm sure you can work it out for yourself. What are wasted words? Taking the prime energy, the primary energy of the human being, to translate what you are in potential and bring it into expression in the actual. And you're wasting that. You're going someplace but getting nowhere. You're taking the tool of the voyage and you're not going any place with it. You're not just doing nothing. You're perverting and betraying the agency of traveling. Words are there to express yourself, to bring you down from your world of potential, everything your body does in the world. You don't have a limited time to do it. You have however many years you're given. You're very finite and limited. You have to bring down everything that you could be into what you should be. So when you take the tool of achievement and you use it to go nowhere, so the punishment will be a journey that goes nowhere. That's the sin of the wasting of seed of human potential. The question we have to ask now is, why is speaking nonsense such an attraction? Why is it so pleasurable? People do it all the time. People make a special point of doing it. People go and sit for 4 or 5 hours together and talk nonsense. I'm not talking about forbidden speech. People are careful with their speech. Never say anything negative about anybody else. What do people get together and, what do they call it here? Chew the fat? Yeah. Shoot the breeze. Talk nonsense. What could be more stupid? Imagine spending 6 hours talking to a friend, and you know what happens? People get together. Men, of course, are completely. Women, people think women are worse, but men are bizarre. Men will spend 6 hours speaking about sports statistics from 1930, who knows what. What difference does it make? Who hit how many, whatever it was in whatever it was, for pity's sake. But what's even more remarkable about the fact that they do it is the fact that it feels so good. That's a deep problem. What does that mean? People will go and sit. You know how it usually goes? People go out. They go out for dinner. They go out someplace. They sit together. 4, 5, 6 hours. 2 hours, whatever it is. The conversation ranges from subject to subject. No, you can't even recall at the end how you got to the subject you're talking about. Do you ever have that experience? Complete random association. One nonsense after another. And absolutely nothing's been achieved. And it feels marvelous. Why is that? Why is that? Let's see if we can try and explain this in deeper terms, and we'll end with this. Fantastic subject to understand. Stay with me carefully as we go through this journey. You know that speech has a higher form, and that's what we call nevuah, prophecy. Niv svasaim means niv really means the production in the sense of produce, right? Tenuvah, you know the Hebrew, you know the Israeli produce company, Tenuvah. The root is niv. Niv means, Tenuvah means the produce of the earth, right? Niv svasaim means the produce of the lips. Nevuah means the welling up of a higher wisdom, or a deeper wisdom into manifestation, a much deeper wisdom. We don't have prophecy anymore. And we need to study for just a brief moment together the descent or the ending of the phase of prophecy in the world. You know, we don't have prophecy anymore. That's an axiom. Prophecy ended with the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Just after that, the last 3 prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they lived about 2,200, 2,300 years ago. During the time of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the last of the great Sanhedrin, that was the time where the last prophets lived. The Talmud says that after that generation we have no more prophecy except in children, dogs, and insane people. Right? That's where we have vestiges of prophecy. And that's a subject for another time, it's not this evening's subject. But those are sources where we have little access to being able to use the information. Right? But nevertheless there is a vestige of prophecy there. However, prophecy in its clear manifestation we don't have anymore. What happened that ended prophecy? What happened? Stay with me carefully. The Gemara says the following thing. The Talmud says this. There was a time when the humankind, not the Jewish people, the human beings, were so tormented and stressed by the temptation to idolatry that the Sanhedrin decided to do something active about it. This will require a little explanation. You know, today idolatry is a bizarre thing for us to understand. What on earth would anybody want doing, bowing down to some figment of his imagination? It's much more than that. Those figments of the imagination are only symbols in the world of something much higher. And that is a whole discussion which we don't have time for now. But at the end of the day, idolatry is an obeisance. It is a projection of the self into something which at the end of the day is nonsense. Right? It's a form of worship that in one, at least, through those symbols and those signs and those carvings and those images are representations of higher things. But at the end of the day, those things are wrong. In whatever subtle dimension they are wrong. There was such a temptation for people to bow down to idols that it was winning the battle. The temptation was outstripping people's ability to cope with it. Right? It was, in fact, the most powerful temptation that there was. And the Sanhedrin decided to do something active to, if you like, exorcise it from human consciousness. We can't understand that today because we don't have it. The Sanhedrin removed from our consciousness the desire to worship idols in its crude and primary form. But the Talmud says it was an unbelievable power. I don't know if you recall, there's a section in the Talmud where Rav Ashi one day, Rav Ashi was one of the Amoraim, in the generation long after prophecy had ended, already more than a century or two after prophecy ended, more than that, 3, 4 centuries, 5. Rav Ashi once went into the Beis Medrash and he said, Niftach b'chavroi. Let's talk about, in English, the only word you could possibly use, he was talking about the king Menashe. Menashe was a great king of Israel who fell into idolatrous ways. So when Rav Ashi wanted to give a shir about this great king Menashe, who had become an idolater and a leader of idolatry, he wanted to belittle him. Because the din is that mockery is appropriate for idolatry. So he opened his discussion, Niftach b'chavroi, let's talk about our buddies. In English, that's the only word you could use. A disparaging term of over-familiarity used in reference to Menashe. That night he had a dream. In his dream, Menashe came to him. And Menashe said, who are you calling your friend? I'm not your friend or your father's friend. And Menashe asked him a halachic question that Rav Ashi was unable to answer. So Rav Ashi turned to Menashe and said to him, he was amazed. He said, if you're that great halachically, if your Torah wisdom is that deep, that you know things I don't, how come you fell into idolatry? There's such a stupidity. Menashe said to him, in our day the temptation to idolatry was so intense that had you been there, you would have noticed that we at least walked to it in delicate fashion. You would have lifted your skirts to run to idolatry. The temptation would have been so irresistible. When Rav Ashi heard that, the next day he went to the Beis Midrash and he said, Niftach berav Ravoy, let's speak about our teachers. What happened? There was a tremendous temptation to idolatry, and it was removed from the world. How did it happen? You know, of course, we have to understand this. The greatest temptation that the human being could have, of course, is the source of your greatest reward. If you overcome the most severe temptation possible, your growth is the maximum that it could be. But the Sanhedrin felt, those incredible and great leaders of the Jewish people, they felt that people were losing the battle. And therefore it was better off not to have the ordeal and not to have its reward. Because if you're going to lose the ordeal, you're not going to get the reward. So they decided to perform surgery. Again, these concepts are way out of our league. But let's study what we can grasp of them. They decided to perform surgery on the human consciousness, on the human psyche, and to remove its draw to idolatry. So they got together and they performed that mystical ceremony. They used the divine names and they called up the Yetzer for Avodah Zarah. They called up the human drive for idolatry. And it came flaming out of where? The Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies in the temple. That's where it was living. And they killed it. They destroyed it. And it left the world. Why was it living there? What is this greatest temptation to the lowliest function that a human being is capable of? Living in the holiest place on earth? Can you feel the meaning? Because it's the same faculty and the same organ that makes you wish to transcend. What is the drive to idolatry? Isn't it to go beyond the self and worship that which is beyond? The faculty that wants to do that is the same faculty that worships Hashem. Only it's misdirected. But it's the same organ. Can you feel this? There's a desire to transcend and melt into that which is greater. Done correctly, it's Avodas Hashem. It's a melting in and a transcendence into a higher level. Done incorrectly, it's a perversion into idolatry, but it's the same organ. And therefore the place that it obviously was manifest was in the holiest place on earth, because that's the lowliest manifestation of the same function. So that's where it came from, and that's what they did, and they killed it. And as soon as they killed, listen well, as soon as they killed the drive to idolatry, you know what died instantly? Prophecy. What is prophecy? The ability to communicate directly with a transcendent reality. And if you take the organ out of the mind that does that, you lose the drive to idolatry, but you lose prophecy too. They knew they were doing that. That was the consequence, and that's what they did. Just to get a slightly deeper feel for this. It's marvelous, these ideas, and it makes you want to go to yeshiva, doesn't it? A slightly deeper insight you can gain. You know, the next section in the Talmud describes the fact that when they succeeded in destroying this desire, what would you have done at that moment? You shouldn't be listening passively, you should be thinking. Had you been there on what in the old country we used to call a good wicket, yes, you see things are going your way, what would you have done next? You know what they tried to do? They tried to take the next step and destroy the drive for immoral sensuality. The world would be a very fine place without that, wouldn't it? What's the center of all our problems? Especially this generation. So they tried to destroy the Yetzer, that means the drive, the lust, for sensual, sexual immorality. And they did. The Gemara says they did. They destroyed it. And 3 days later, there were no eggs in the whole country of Israel. The land was devoid of eggs. Chickens were not laying eggs anymore. Because when you destroy that function, you destroy all aspects of it. Rashi says remarkably, again, if you're thinking, you should ask me a question. As soon as they destroyed it, there were no more eggs. The chickens stopped laying eggs. You should say to me, but what about the eggs that were already in the chickens? Eggs take a while. They form in the chicken. And over a process of days, they are then laid. So if the heat of the desire for reproduction had left the world, but at least the eggs that were already within the chicken should have been laid. Good question, no? Rashi says even that didn't happen because the body heat of the animals dropped. So the process of development of their own, that's what happened to the world. So the rabbis hurriedly brought it back because that would have been the end of the human race. The Gemara says, but when what would you have done? Think with me. They destroyed it. No more desire in this area. The end of all reproduction. What would you have done? They tried to bring it back, that a man should have this desire, but only for his wife, and for no one else. And from heaven they got a message. Min shemaya lo yahavi palga. From heaven they don't give halves. You either have it or you don't have it. It's an organ, it's a function, it's a faculty. You either have it or you don't. If you take out the liver of a human being, you have none of the functions of the liver. You can't remove a human being's liver and expect some of the functions to remain. When they excised that organ from human consciousness, so what remained was none of it. But and they had to bring it back. They had to bring it back intact. But they managed a small victory. The Talmud says they managed to put their finger in its eye. Meaning, they managed to bring it back with a certain blindness. You know what that is? That from that day on, a man has no sensual attraction for his mother or sister. That they managed to achieve. And since that day, it's been a fact. That a man can have a very attractive mother, sister, and there's a blank in that department. That's what they managed to achieve. But what did we learn? That the general principle is when you take away an organ, you take away all its functions. When you take away idolatry, you take away prophecy. And from that moment on, prophecy left the world. It was a historic moment. Tanakh was closed then. The books of the Bible, the canon as we call it, scripture was closed. They ended prophecy and closed the scripture. By the way, you know what transpired just after that? The very next generation saw the founding of a religion that reopened scripture and reclaimed prophecy. The founder of that religion was born on the day that Ezra died, who was the member of the last Sanhedrin. They specifically closed it so that that claim should not be made. But let's take the final step. What did they do? Stay again with me. They excised from the mind the desire for idolatry, and what left hand in hand with it was the desire for prophecy. That's wonderful and deep, but what we need to ask ourselves is, listen well, stay together with me. What remained in its place? What remained? What happens when you remove an organ? What remains in the body? What happens when you remove a faculty in the mind? What remains? An empty space. And from that moment on, the drive to transcendence became focused on emptiness. And from that moment on, the desire to transcend is a desire to go nowhere. And the highest pleasure became an activity that goes no place. Until then, anybody wasting time speaking nonsense would have been a travesty of a human being. Somebody sitting speaking nonsense hour after hour would have been regarded as insane. But after that moment, the highest drive and derivation of pleasure became the desire to transcend into a place that is going nowhere. That's an end in itself. Let me try and explain a little bit more deeply. Stay together with me. And you know what that sense of pleasure is? Do you know what that drive to nothingness is? That was once a drive to transcend into the correct source of all existence? Do you know what the sensation is? It's a sensation of the next world. It's nothing less than a minor experience in this world of living in the eternal world of the next world. Why? Because that's a world that goes no place. It is because it is. It's not a building and a working towards. It's a having arrived. And when a person speaks nonsense, when a person wastes time and does a thing that goes nowhere, the experience is the experience of living in the next world. You've arrived, there's no place to go. The most potent illustration is within marriage, but this is not the forum in which to discuss it. It has to be understood. It's the sharpest manifestation of a sense of arrival. That has to be discussed in a separate forum. You have to invite me some other time, and I'll refuse. But there's a sense of having arrived, of gotten to a place from which there's no place to go. That is an unbelievable pleasure. Let me try and illustrate this just a little bit more carefully, and we'll stop. When do we feel that? We feel it at the moment of transition from work to reward. The first moment of a vacation. You know what the pleasure is? Not the fact that you're relaxing. It's the sensation that the work's been done. As the doors are locked and the obligation is dropped, there's a sensation of being where you have to be. Of course, you get bored an hour later and you become impossible to live with. But it's in the first hour, the first day of that vacation, when the final school bell rings, when the final... You know what word we use in Hebrew for someone who dies? We say the person is niftar. You know what niftar means? Divested of obligation. Potter. Their obligations drop. That's the next world. It's a situation of being devoid, divested of obligation. That's niftar. The ecstasy of moving into that dimension is the ecstasy of moving from the work phase into witnessing and experiencing the reward that's been built by that work. Do you know how we generate that experience? By playing games. Do you know what a game is? When people play a game, people do that, you know. They don't only speak nonsense, they also play games. They sit around a table, hour after hour, and a little thing goes around and backwards and forwards and up and down and backwards and forwards again, and then it starts again and it goes backwards and forwards, and it's wonderful. Wonderful. And intelligent people do that, and they love it. You know what the pleasure is of playing a game? And you know what? The more trivial, the better. You know why? Because a game that's entirely trivial is a time spent in a place where there's no place to go and no obligation to go anywhere. You're doing it as an end in itself, and therefore it's an experience of complete freedom. It's a movement towards the movement itself. Everything else you do has a sense of responsibility, a sense of obligation, because it's being done to get someplace. But a game is an experience that you do only in order to do it. You don't do it for anything beyond itself. And that's a flavor of the next world. That's what Shabbos is. What do you do on Shabbos? You just exist. You don't build on Shabbos. You just arrive. That's the intense pleasure of Shabbos. It's not making something new. It's just being. Of course, the depth of this is the essence of the experience of existing, which is what Hashem's essence is all about, as far as we can understand. So it's a divine feeling. You know what the word in Hebrew is for a game? You know, let's look at two parameters that illustrate it. First of all, what does the Torah say? You know, the Talmud describes what God spends his time doing. What Hashem does. You know what the Talmud says? He plays with the Torah. He plays. You know what that means? In silly, immature terms, playing a game means playing a game. But in spiritual depth, playing a game means existing in a state of intrinsic, self-justified essence. And isn't that the only way we can refer to the divine essence? You know the word sha'ashua in Hebrew. You know what the word is in Hebrew for a game? Sha'ashua. It's a remarkable Hebrew. You know, Hebrew roots are usually usually three-letter roots. The word sha'ashua is a four-letter root of very unusual type. In Hebrew, you have very few words like that. Gal, for example. Gal means a wheel, because it means roll and roll, the rolling of the rolling. A duplicated root. Sha'ashua in Hebrew is sha. You know what sha means? To turn towards. Like al minchas kain lo sha. Hashem never turned towards the offering of kain, right? Sha. You know what sha'ashua means? Sha'ashua means turning towards the turning towards. Isn't that what a game is? So when you play a game that's entirely trivial and completely pointless, you are sensing a faint notion, a wisp of an experience of the next world. Again, I can't go into detail, but in marriage there's that sensation. And that's why those moments of having arrived are the sweetest possible moments in all of human existence, because there's no place to go. That's the place to be, and all else disappears at that moment. It can only be a moment in this world. Of course, what this generation does, what does this generation do? Instead of using those experiences as a learning ground for getting stuck into the work and the responsibility to build that in eternity, this generation tries to grasp that in and of itself all the time and play games always. And what does this generation do with marriage, or the intimate and sacred bond between man and woman? Use it only for its non-responsible side. Isn't that what this generation does? The concept of using experiences of arrival, of pure tachlis, of having gotten to a place where there's no place else to go, is to use it to bond oneself into responsibility and build. And this generation is one that uses that for complete exemption from all responsibility. The intimate bond between man and woman is the most intense and elevated experience that there can be. You know, the great Mashgiach of Mir used to say a beautiful illustration of this generation's evil in this department. Again, I can't go into a lot of detail, but I'll just refer to it for you. It's worth pointing out. He used to say this: you know, why does Hashem make that intimacy between man and woman so sweet, so powerfully attractive? Because it's the most important thing there is. And we said before, if that doesn't exist, you have no human beings. And where he has his most important work, he puts his most sweet, his sweetest drawer. Right? That's how it works. And then he said a mashal like this, beautiful mashal. When a mother wants her child to eat bread, you know what she does? She puts honey on the bread. You know why? The mother wants the child to eat the bread, so she's prepared to put honey on. The child wants the honey, so he's prepared to eat the bread. And it's a deal. That's how it goes. She's not interested in the honey. She does it so the child eats the bread. The child's not interested in the bread, but he eats the bread so that he can get the honey. But a schlechte kind, you know what a bad child does? Licks off the honey and throws the bread away. And that's what this generation does. Longs to live in the world of nonsense and complete irresponsibility and transcendence for its own sake, without the responsibility, without the work. And that is an introduction to the concept of wasting words, wasting time, the higher world of speech, creation in the lower world, all those parallels. That is the problem of